The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
God of all grace and tender, fierce mercy, I speak in your name and in your presence, asking that my words would be pleasing to you, guided by your Spirit, and that the hearts and minds of your people would be open to you. Through Christ our Lord, I pray. Amen. So this morning we have the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. How many of you heard this parable before? That's what I thought. So because we're familiar with it, it's easy to pass it by, and also because Jesus tells us the moral of the story twice. It's easy to think, okay, I got it, and just move on. He told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Oh yeah, that's about those other guys. And all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. Yes, that's for the other guys. That's how we can just sort of let it slide by. Maybe we could be helped by taking a closer look. So, first of all, in Luke's gospel, over and over, he pairs things or people to make contrasting images to make his point. Sometimes there's hyperbole in that. Sometimes maybe it looks like hyperbole, but it's not really. Maybe there's a depth to it that can pass us by. In this case, there's an extreme example of a Pharisee. And by the way, not all Pharisees were like this Pharisee. And then there's the extreme example of the tax collector. And so, perhaps if we're not careful, we think that we're not in this story because it's extreme. And again, there's other stories like it where there's a self-righteous person and a very humble person. And always the invitation is to let it speak to our heart. Let it be a mirror of the true truth of me. Let it invite me to see the truth of my thoughts and my feelings. And from there, how I behave. So the word Pharisee means separated one or holy one. And in the Gospels, often the Pharisees are depicted as Jesus' adversaries or opponents. And we need to be careful that that's not every Pharisee, that's some Pharisees. And the vocation of a Pharisee, to be a separated one or a holy one, was the vocation to protect the Torah, the law of God, to protect its holiness. It was described as the precious instrument by which the world was created. It was described as the expression of the perfect wisdom and will of God. And the Pharisees were dedicated to protecting that. And they had many more teachings than just the Torah itself, the goal of which was to protect the Torah and its holiness. An admirable aspiration, a worthy vocation. The Pharisees were noted for their scrupulous adherence both to the written Torah and to the many commentaries about the Torah, all of which in a desire to protect its holiness. This Pharisee's prayer, by the way, echoes prayers in the Psalms. I thank you that you have watched over me. I thank you that you have kept me from lawlessness. I thank you that you have kept me from being among the evildoers. I thank you that you have watched over my mind and my heart and helped me live a righteous life. The Psalms do not say, and I thank you that I'm not like these other evildoers and jerks. It does not say that. Some years ago, I was involved in the organization of Thomas Keating, the Father Thomas Keating, a Roman Catholic monk, who many of you know of. Many of you probably don't. Father Thomas founded, along with two other monks, the Centering Prayer Movement, which has become quite popular in the last 30 years, and I think it's influenced hundreds of thousands of people globally. His organization, Contemplative Outreach, has regional groups all around the world supporting people in the practice of Christian meditation. Just think of centering prayer as Christian meditation. And some years ago, I was invited by Father Thomas to join with about 25 others, and this was a series of retreats he was putting on with people who had been practicing centering prayer for 20 years or more. And he invited us to come and share our experience. He wanted it to be a learning experience for us to hear how the practice of this prayer had impacted our lives, and he wanted to hear about what had gone on in our lives. And so, in the first day of gathering, we began one by one to share. And you know how that goes. The first person shared 5 minutes, and the next shared 10, and the next shared 20, and the next shared for an hour, you know. It took a long time. But deeply meaningful stories of transformed lives. And again, this practice of Christian meditation takes us deep into ourselves. Offers opportunity for profound transformation. And so we'd gone all the way around the room. I think it took several hours. We'd had breaks and whatnot. And I had paid attention to the people sharing, And I was actually seated we were in a circle of 25, and I was like 3 or 4 people from Father Thomas, so I couldn't really see him. I was watching the people. It came back to him, and what I noticed were tears were streaming down his face. And many people had talked about the practice of centering prayer, but also about Father Thomas's impact on their life. And tears were streaming down his face. He could barely get the words out, and he said, "It's all the Spirit. It's all the Spirit." He choked it out the third time in his tears. It's all the Spirit. A man who had a separated, holy life dedicated to supporting people in prayer and relationship with God. Unlike this Pharisee, he didn't attribute it to himself. He attributed it to the work of God. Every religious person needs to pause and ask ourselves, when I come before God, do I say things like, I go to church, I pledge, I go to communion, I participate in the confession, I say my prayers. Oh God, look at me. By the way, be careful. If the first thing is, I don't do that, think again. There's a question of whether he's actually even praying. He's telling God of his own virtue. The text is actually very interesting in this. Verse 11 says, the Pharisee standing by himself. Now, again, it's one of those moments where English doesn't capture the subtle nuance. What it really says, it actually literally says, is standing by himself or to himself he was praying. What? Standing by himself, or could be to himself, he was praying. It's very ambiguous. That is to say, the guy's standing there talking to himself. Self-congratulatory. He's not thanking God. He's praising himself for his religious activity. And he's all by himself. Can be taken both ways. I think the ambiguity is intentional in Jesus' parable. He separated himself from, don't you love it, those people. Help me, Lord. He separated himself from those people, and he separated himself from God. He's not talking to God, he's talking to himself. And the deepest truth of all, he separated himself from himself. He doesn't see the true truth of himself. He sees himself in a way that's not true. The tax collector. Now, again, it's an extreme example that Jesus would use the tax collector in contrast to the Pharisee whose life was dedicated to holiness. Tax collectors, one commentator said, an honest tax collector is an oxymoron. And everybody knew that. And it was literally systemic that you purchased from the Roman government the region over which you could be a tax collector. You collected taxes for the state, and then you collected other taxes that you could get as much as you could get, some of which you got to keep. And it was just, you extorted it. You took it from them whether they were willing to give it to you or not, and the Roman government helped you in it. It was as dishonest as it could be. And no faithful Jew was a tax collector. They were despised. This man, notice it doesn't say he was standing by himself. It says he was standing afar off. Far from what? In his own mind and heart, the story suggests far from God. He comes, and I love this, not ashamed to be ashamed. He comes knowing he has nothing to give but his failure. So much so that he can't. The normal posture for a Jew praying in the temple was to raise their eyes and their hands. He won't even look up. He's bowed down. And he comes, and again, the language that says, be merciful to me, that's fair translation, but it's actually more profound than that. The word he uses is not the normal word for mercy. It's used only twice in the New Testament. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's used many times to reference the Day of Atonement and the expiation for sins, or God's act to forgive the sins of the people that happen once a year on the Day of Atonement. The only other time the word is used in the New Testament is in the book of Hebrews, when it talks about Jesus is the one who made the atoning sacrifice for all of humanity. And what he looks down on the ground and begs his God is, be reconciled to me. He comes unable to do anything for himself. Oh God, be reconciled to me, a sinner. Don't you love it? No presumption in his heart. No, because of my virtue, I'm welcomed by you. Be reconciled to me, a sinner. And I love Jesus' response. This man went home justified. Now, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but why would Jesus say he went home? What's the point of saying he went home justified? Maybe it's that he was the same guy when he went home, but everything was changed. Maybe in that moment of being reconciled to his God, he was transformed. In his circumstances and his relationships, life began to be different. Because he came to his God with the true truth of his need. He came to his God not ashamed to be ashamed. He came to his God not relying on his own good works, not relying on his own virtue, not relying on his own religious deeds, but begging God to expiate his sins. The word justified could also be understood as pardoned. It could also be understood as saved. It could also be understood as the fierce mercy of God that was strong enough to get past even the crimes of this tax collector and reconcile him. Amen.